Welcome everybody to Daf Yomi Masechet Shekalim. Looking forward to starting a new Masechet. It is a short one, and we're actually going to be learning 3 prakim, 3 chapters, all in 1 hour. So I'll see how fast I can speak. First of all, Moadim L'Simcha to everyone. Chag Sameach, and thank you for joining me on during the Chag. And we have a lot to do. So we have 8 daf we're going to try to do today from daf bet. As we all know, the Gemara always starts on page 2. This is meant to remind us that there is no beginning and no end to learning, to our Jewish learning, especially in the Talmud, and therefore we start on page 2. So we are going to do daf, I think I actually on the email wrote 1 through 9, so I'll take that back. Daf 2 through 9, we're going to do that today. Okay, daf bet number 2 starts with telling us that there are different dates in the Jewish calendar and what happens on those dates. First of all, Rabbi Natan Farber is back. This is Style Adaf. So I brought you some of his pictures today, and you can check him out. He has a website. He's on Facebook and Instagram, I think, as well. So he has really some beautiful images, so I shared some of them with you. I will be sharing them tonight. Okay, so Daf Bet tells us that on certain dates in Adar and in Nisan, different things happen. So as you can see here, on the 1st of Adar, they publicize the obligation to give the shkalim, the Masechet Shekel, which is what we're going to be talking about in this Masechet. They also talk about Kilaayim, and they remind people not to grow Kilaayim. Again, Kilaayim is a mixture of 2 species, 2 different plants. You are not allowed to plant them together. Therefore, and especially as we know, if you look outside the window, especially here in Israel, Adar, Nisan, that's when things start to grow. So the Beit Din, the courts, will proclaim, making sure that everybody realizes that they are not allowed to be growing Kilaayim. On the 15th of Adar, we read the Megillah in the walled cities. We repair roads and streets and attend to public needs. We mark graves and inspect the fields for Kilaayim. Now we're going to go out again. 2 weeks later, things are starting to grow, and now they go to inspect. As we know, it's Purim, so that's the 15th of Adar, and they're repairing the roads, as we know, to get ready for the Aliyah LaRegel, for the pilgrimage to Jerusalem that will be happening for Pesach, which is exactly nowadays, this time period. So on the 15th of Adar is when they're going to be preparing for that. Okay, the Gemara says that you need to bring shkalim at the proper time. This is done by the 1st of Nisan, and as we'll see later on, it was also the Masechet Shekel, the half shekel, was put in containers in the temple, and a third of each container was taken 3 times a year. Basically, and we'll see again as we continue in today's class, it was taken 3 times a year, 15 days before each holiday, meaning before Pesach, before Shavuot, and before Sukkot. Money was taken out from these containers. Taking of this money is called Trumat Halishka, meaning a separation of money from Lishka means like the office, but from the place where we had the Masechet Shekel. This is done 3 times a year. We'll talk more about it a little bit later. The Gemara continues and says that we need to announce that the shkalim, it's time to donate the shkalim. What happens if Adar is a leap year? Next year, if those of you didn't know, next year is a leap year, which means that we will be having Adar Aleph and Adar Bet, meaning we have two Adars. So then the question is, what is the real one? So the Gemara talks that basically the real one is going to be Adar Bet. That's when we're going to celebrate Purim, and that is when they're going to collect the Masechet Shekel as well. The same thing for Kilaayim, because the Gemara explains, since we're talking about seeing when things grow, if you have an Adar Aleph, that's going to be very early, and nothing is really going to be growing at that time. Okay, the Gemara continues and talks about reading verses in the Torah, and you can read them either for good or for bad, meaning like the Jewish people gave up their jewelry to donate it for the temple, but they also donated their jewelry to build the golden calf. So we see the same words are used, one for good and one for bad. The same idea with lifting their voices could be good and could be bad. Okay, the Gemara continues and says that there are three times that the Jewish people donated money to the temple. One was, again, to build the adanim, the holders for the pillars that enclosed the tabernacle. One was Masechet Shekel, which is what we're going to be talking about in this Masechet, which was used, as we'll see again in a minute, it was used for communal sacrifices. And the third was when the Jewish people donated all sorts of things for the construction of the tabernacle of the Mishkan in the desert. Okay, the Gemara continues, and we're now going to move on to Daf Gimel, Daf number 3. We mentioned that there were public needs. So the Gemara explains what are these public needs. It says that they made sure that they wrapped up any civil or criminal court cases. They made sure that there were any outstanding things that the courts needed to do, they did, like sota or egla arufa. These are things that the courts, the Beit Din, needed to take care of throughout the year. They made sure that all of this was done in Adar. The reason is that Nisan, it's interesting, we know that Tishrei is the beginning of the year. We have Rosh Hashanah, but when we learn Masechet Rosh Hashanah, we'll see there are actually 4 New Years. One New Year is in Nisan, which again we're in the middle of, and we want to make sure that all court cases of the previous year are finished up by the beginning of Nisan. So that is what is being done. The Gemara is mentioning on Daf Gimel. Another thing that they're doing is marking graves. As we mentioned in previous Masechtot, it was very important to make sure that they knew where graves were on the road. Remember, we talked about the importance of not becoming impure, tameh, and one way that you could become impure was if you stood on a grave. So they were very careful to make sure that they marked graves. And here on Daf Gimel, they really talk about how does one mark a grave? Do we put the stone on the top, next to, on the side? What kind of stone is being used? So all of this is being learned from this pasuk here, that basically when you are in the land, you have to make sure that you mark where the grave is. And here, each word is being explained as something else. So the Gemara says that basically you first of all mark the graves, and if it, let's say, rains, you have to mark it again to make sure that, and here when I mean mark, I mean literally like paint a stone, like you can see here, like an X on the stone. That is one way to mark a grave, and you need to make sure that is done. And the Gemara says even on Chol HaMoed, which is appropriate for today, meaning even on Chol HaMoed one can do this because it is very important. The Gemara talks about the importance of marking, let's say, for bones. So you can see here, right here lies someone's skull and spinal column, showing the importance of marking that. So definitely for part of the person, even if there is no flesh. And then the Gemara talks about putting the stone, as you can see here, right here lie markers on the side of the grave, right? You don't put it on top, but you put it on the side. And then, right, if there are two rocks, then if you walked in between them, then you are not considered impure, because we think that, again, the body isn't in the whole space and maybe you missed it. The Gemara says that you do not, right, it says here lies flesh without bones. The Gemara says you do not do that. You do not mark if you, let's say, buried flesh of a person, but not any bones. The Gemara says because it's going to erode away, and there's no reason to make people think that they are impure if there's really, after a certain amount of time, there won't be anything there, and therefore we do not mark it. Okay, on to Kilaayim. Again, as I mentioned, Kilaayim is when one plants two different species next to each other. You are not allowed to do it. There's a prohibition. So they used to uproot it and leave it in the field. And then the farmers were like, oh, this is a good deal. The people will come by, they'll uproot it, and I get free labor. So then they decided that they would actually make it hefker, meaning they would make it as if it was not owned by anyone, and then anybody could come along and claim all the things that they uprooted. And from here, the Gemara goes into a discussion, what's called in Hebrew, hefker beit din hefker, meaning that the courts, the Jewish courts, have the ability and the power to make something ownerless, even if, right, not based on a court case, whatever, if they made a ruling that they need to make something ownerless, they are allowed to do that. So that was very important to recognize that the court, the Beit Din, has that power, and they can use it in order to punish somebody who has transgressed different transgressions. Okay, the Gemara continues and says that we have to guard the month of Nisan. Again, as I frequently mention, I love when Daf Yomi aligns to whatever's going on in our lives. So again, we're learning it in Nisan and the month of Nisan. And the Gemara says Nisan must be in the spring. It must be when the crops start to ripen, which is why, again, as I mentioned, as the calendar gets earlier and earlier, the calendar will give us a leap year in order to rectify the change in the season. Okay, the next Mishnah on Daf Gimel, on Daf number 3, continues talking about on the 15th of Adar, the money changers will sit in Jerusalem or in many other cities, so that people can give the machatzit shekel, the half a shekel. So the money changers start to sit out to give change and collect it. On the 25th of Adar, they would only sit in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, meaning at this point it's getting later on in the month, and if you were late, you needed to go to the temple in Jerusalem in order to pay the shekel, the half a shekel. Now, the question is, what happens if you did not pay? So the Gemara discusses that that on the 25th of Adar, people would take this collateral. Here he calls it a pledge. In Hebrew, it's a mashkon. Mashkon is collateral, and this is basically a way to ensure that people paid their dues. Right? Again, machatzit shekel is seen as as something that is due to, right, like a tax. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next daf. But here, the question is, who could they take this collateral from? So it said, first of all, they take it from, here it says, from the Levites, from the Israelites, from the converts, from the slaves who are freed, meaning all of these people, the first column, are people who are obligated to give the half shekel. Therefore, if they didn't by the 25th of Adar, a collateral was taken. But they would not take it from women and children. Again, the idea is that women and children are not obligated to give the half a shekel, and therefore they would not be penalized for not paying. You can see here he wrote, because some say it's a time-bound mitzvah, and as we learned before, women are exempt from time-bound mitzvahs, and again here slaves are as well. The same thing with children. Ktanim are children. Again, for children, they are not obligated. However, if their parents do begin to pay, then they need to continue paying every year. Now we get a very interesting discussion about the priests. There is a machloket, an argument, whether the priests are required or not. I would say in general, they would say that they are required, though the priests gave a pretty good argument why they should not be required. And therefore, they argue that, again, here you see there's an argument whether or not you can take a collateral from them or not. Okay, the next Mishnah says that you can, however, as I mentioned, women are not obligated to pay the machatzita shekel, the half shekel. However, if they do want to donate, then they were accepted. However, from non-Jews, we do not accept their donations. And here again, we get into a discussion about the Kutim. The Kutim were a nation of people who lived in Israel, and they converted. There is a disagreement if their conversion was wholehearted or not. And in different places in the Gemara, we see different opinions. Some say that they convert wholeheartedly and therefore they are seen as Jews. Other opinions are that they did not really convert wholeheartedly and they do not keep the commandments, and therefore we view them as non-Jews. So here we see at the bottom of daf number 3, Gimel, that we do not accept from the Kutim, and here it seems to imply that they are similar to non-Jews. Okay, daf number 4 is we're going to introduce a new concept, and that is what's called the Kalbone. The Kalbone is added to the shekel payment to make up the difference of the value. Now, we have a disagreement as to what is the Kalbone. Is it biblical in origin or is it rabbinic? So again, is it that they have to give it, or is it that they in certain cases they had to pay it and in other cases they didn't? So let's go through a little bit on daf 4. So it says that the Levites, the Leviim, and the Israelites, Israel, would have to give the Kalbone. The priests and the women didn't have to give the Kalbone because they were not obligated in the first place. And here you see that this is going according to the opinion that the priests were not obligated. What you do notice, just as an aside, what you notice in this Masechet, I think I mentioned it a little bit last week when I gave the introduction, that this Masechet, because it is of the Jerusalem Bible, it's Yerushalmi, it is less edited. And therefore, what we're used to seeing in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Talmud Bavli, usually we see a disagreement. There seems to be some sort of consensus, and then we continue in the line of reasoning. Here it seems that there are disagreements, and then there are the Gemara keeps talking without really resolving any of the disagreements. And therefore, later conversations are based on different opinions that we saw previously. So I think it's just important to recognize that we shouldn't get too confused and recognize that if something is contradictory then to something that we just said, it's usually because there's a disagreement on what this is. So just for an example, like we just mentioned, are the Kohanim, are the priests obligated or not? It seemed from Daf Gimel that they are not, that they are obligated. Here on Daf Dalid, it seems that they are not obligated. So again, there are differences of opinions as we keep going through the Gemara. So too over here, this machloket, whether the Kalbone is biblical in origin, meaning anytime you pay or anytime you are obligated to give the half shekel, you must also give the Kalbone, because it's really just evening out the value of the shekel, or is it just rabbinic and it's kind of like a either a surcharge or I guess surcharge is a good way to explain it, right? And therefore, and we'll see later on where that surcharge went. Okay, so let's continue. So again, the Gemara says, if you paid with a selah, right? So that's on the right here. There's the selah. The selah really equals 2.5 shekel. So if you give a selah for the machatzita shekel, so then you need to get change back, and then you might have to add the kalbone. Right, so if you're paying for, let's say, a poor person or for a neighbor, so then you don't have to pay the kalbone. Let's say brothers who are partners, we're going to talk about them in a little bit, they do not have to give a kalbone. But let's say you are paying, the kalbone is equal to 1 maneh or half a ma'ah, and that's what you can see. Here, this talks about it being two different people joining together. And the Gemara discusses, again, as I mentioned, on Daf 4, whether the kuti is like a Jew or is like a non-Jew. And the Gemara continues and talks about not accepting money for non-Jews in the construction of the second temple. They wanted to make sure that the non-Jews would not be able to point to something and say, you see that beautiful door? The reason they have it is because of me. And again, the Gemara says that they would accept any donation after the construction was complete, or maybe they would accept it even before, as long as it was not a distinct donation, right? If they just wrote a check, well, not wrote a check, but if they just gave some money, so then that would be fine. But if it was something very distinct, they would not accept it. What about sacrifices? Non-Jews are allowed to donate a sacrifice. They can donate an olah, but maybe not money. There's a difference of opinion what we accept from them or not. Let's continue discussing the kalbone. Again, the kalbone was added as a surcharge, again, either in biblical origin or rabbinic in origin. So now let's see who needed to give the kalbone, right? So if you give a shekel and you need change, so then you need to pay the kalbone. And the Gemara talks about God showing a fiery coin. That was the picture over here, sorry. This picture with the fiery coin, that is God showing a fiery coin to Moshe when he said, Zeh yitnu. Anytime the Torah says Zeh, it usually means that God is pointing to something. So what was he pointing at? The Gemara says that he actually showed him a fiery shekel, And he said, this is what the Jewish people need to give, and our coins are imperfect, and therefore we need to add the Kalbone in order to make up the difference in the value. So again, if you gave a full shekel, then you get half back, and then you get half back. So you have to pay 2 kalbones or maybe 3 kalbones. And now the Gemara talks about brothers who are partners. So now we're going to move on to our Daf HaChaim charts. And we're going to, what does this mean, brothers who are partners? Basically, these brothers inherit their father's property. So there is one estate, it belonged to the father. The father passed away and left the estate to, let's say, 2 brothers. Now, what happens? The brothers decide to split the estate. You'll take the house over here, and I'll take the cows in the field, and you take $500,000, and I'll take $500,000. So they split the property. Then they say, well, our father had a really good business, so let's put all the money together, and then they now become partners. Now the question is, what happens when they rejoin? So the Gemara says that when they divide the estate, so then when they pay, it's their own money, and therefore they add a kalbon. But they do not have to pay. They do not have to do what's called maaser behima. We're going to talk about this more in the next chapter, or we're going to talk about it more, yes, in the next chapter. But maaser behima is when they would give every 10th animal, and they would give it to the temple, and then they would go and eat it there. If people are partners and they own animals together, then they are exempt from giving maaser behima. So the Gemara says basically anytime they have to pay the kalbon, they are exempt from maaser behima, and vice versa, right? So if they didn't divide the estate, then it's not a regular partnership, and then they would be, again, exempt from the kalbon, but have to give maaser behima. So we see that these things work kind of reciprocally. On daf number 5, the question is, what if they only partially separate their animals? So that's, you can see here on the top is, again, when they're patur means exempt. When they're exempt from maaser behima, they are obligated, chayav, they're obligated in the kalbon, and vice versa. What happens, that's again, excuse me, that's again if they separated it completely or didn't separate it completely. What happens if they separate the animals? That's what this is over here. The animals are separated, but the money stayed the same, or they separated the money and the animals stayed together. And then here the Gemara says that, again, if they divide the money, then but not the animals, then they are not obligated in either the kalbon or maaser behima. But if they did divide, the animals, but not the, excuse me, 1 second. So if they did divide the money, but they did not divide the animals, then they are obligated in both. Again, they need different things for each one. And with that, 1 second. Okay. Now there's the last thing on, before we finish this chapter, the Gemara asks, what happens with this Kalbone, right? How do we view it? As I mentioned before, we can see it as biblical in origin, or we can see it as a rabbinic decree. So the Gemara says, oh, one opinion is that it goes with the Machatzit Shekel to the temple. If that's the case, then that is consistent with the opinion that it is biblical in origin, and therefore it goes wherever the shekel goes. Another option is that it goes to the temple, but it is for other types of sacrifices, voluntary sacrifices. Another option is that the money was used to buy gold to cover the walls of the inner sanctuary, the Kodesh HaKodashim of the temple. So I think all those opinions are consistent with the fact that this is biblical in origin. Then another two opinions are that the money goes to the money changers as a fee. This is consistent with the idea that this is only rabbinic in origin, and it's actually a surcharge, right? We all know when you go to change money, sometimes they take a fee. So one could say that the Kalbone was a fee that was instituted for the benefit of the money changers. And the last is that it actually paid for the travel expenses of the money changers. So it is interesting to see the difference of opinions and how, as I mentioned before, it leads to other opinions. Lynn mentioned, yes, the doors to the temple, yes, so they were actually bronze doors. They were given by Nicanor. They were called Sha'ar Nicanor, and you're right, they were accepted. I think this was later on, not at the exact construction, but later on in the Second Temple. And you are right that they are accepted. If I remember correctly, there's a story about it in the Gemara. I'm not recalling exactly, but I think in this case, we do want to give, right? They named it Sha'ar Nicanor. And I think that it's actually on purpose and very thoughtful in that sense. So you're right. I have to look into exactly. There is a very famous story with them. I will look it up and try to remind myself the story. But you are correct that was accepted as a gift. Okay, with that, we finished the first chapter of Masechet Shekalim. As this chapter has only 22 pages, we are going to go through these chapters quickly. Next, the next chapter begins. We're still on Daf 5. The Mishnah says that, again, the money changers go out to collect the half shekel pieces. Now, if they have to carry it back, that's very heavy. They are allowed to change them for gold coins. However, they are not allowed to change it into anything else, the Mishnah is going to tell us in a minute. When they bring it to the temple, they are put into collection boxes. These are called a shofar. It was called a shofar because of its shape. It was very wide at the bottom and narrow at the top. We're going to see a little bit later on to make sure that nobody can take any money from it. And these collection boxes were also in other cities to make it easier to collect money throughout the country. Okay, now we get into, I think, a little bit of a complicated discussion about sending your coins. Now, as we mentioned before, you're sending coins from one city to Jerusalem. So you send the coin with a messenger, and then what happens if it gets stolen or lost? So the Gemara says it depends when it was stolen or lost. If it was, and this is the Trumat Halishka. Again, Trumat Halishka is when they remove the coins in the temple, right, from the collection box. If it was lost or stolen before, sorry, one second. The first case in the Mishnah is if the truma was taken already, meaning before, this is the first one, right? This case, you sent the coins, they already took the money from the temple, and then the messenger who's still on his way lost the money on the way. Then the messenger needs to take an oath to the treasurer of the temple, and the people are exempt from paying it again. However, if it was lost or stolen before the money was taken from the temple, then he needs to swear to the people that he did not, again, the messenger needs to take an oath that he was not negligent, and then they need to give more, again, they need to pay again. What happens if the money was found? So then both of those shekel are sent to the temple, but you can't use it for next year, meaning you basically, well, we'll see what happens to it in a minute. Okay, so now the Gemara says on daf number 5 that you can, as I mentioned before, only switch the half shekel pieces into gold coins, but you cannot switch it into something else, meaning a jewel, a pearl. The Gemara explains that this is because things lose value, and apparently, not apparently, but it seems that even in those days, silver and gold are pretty consistent in their value. They'll fluctuate a little bit, but not too much. From here, the Gemara goes into a discussion about the messenger who is collecting the money. What type of messenger is he, or what type of shomer, right? He is watching, he's a guard for the money. What are his responsibilities? And we can see that in the Gemara as well. Okay, the Gemara continues and says, what happens if a person lost his own shekel, right? What happens? So then he needs to pay it again if he didn't give it to the temple yet. Or, says the Gemara, no, he separated his half shekel, and wherever it is, meaning he fulfilled his obligation to separate the money, and as long as it was sanctified, then it doesn't matter where it is. And here we get to, again, a new concept, and that is new shekel versus old shekel. So tiklin chadatin, again, taf and shin are interchangeable in Aramaic. So tiklin is really shkalim. So shkalim that are new, those are the ones that were collected this year. And the old ones are basically left over. We're going to see what happens with them. If you look in your Gemara, interestingly enough, one of the commentaries of this Masechet is called Tiklin Chadatin, right? New Shkalim. So that comes from this daf with the concept of new shekel. Okay, the next Mishnah talks about Me'ila. Me'ila means, we've seen it before, it means misappropriating or stealing money that is already sanctified. So basically means you're stealing from God, and that is misappropriating things that are sanctified for your own benefit. So we need to figure out when that happens. Right, so if a person used a shekel that his friend gave him to deposit, right, it wasn't for him and he pretended that it was his. So again, if the money was already separated in the temple, then it's as if he has stolen from the temple, and that is, as we know, problematic. But again, what if a person used something that was already sanctified for the machatzita shekel? Again, if it's after the money was separated, so then, again, it is considered me'ila, and he has misappropriated funds. The Mishnah says that you can use ma'aser sheni or shvi'it. Again, ma'aser sheni is a tithe that you need to take up to Jerusalem to eat. So it's sanctified. But what's interesting about this sanctification is it could be redeemed, which we're going to see in a minute. And Shvi'it is produce that has, or money that has sanctity from being from a Shemitah year, which, by the way, is coming up in 6 months. This coming year, next year, is a Shemitah year, which means the produce that grows in Israel next year has sanctity to it. So you can use that money for your half a shekel, and we'll see how that works. Okay. So sorry. So the Mishnah actually, so the Gemara asks, how do you do that? So you remove the sanctity from the Maser Sheni by taking a regular coin and saying, this coin is now Maser Sheni. So what have I done? You've transferred the sanctity to this new coin, and then the other coin becomes the half shekel. So that is how it works. Okay. Daf number 6. I hope I'm not going too fast. Sorry, but we have a few more to go. Daf number 6 talks about if you're collecting your half shekel. Again, a half shekel is a piece, a coin, but it also could be many coins together in the value of a half a shekel. So there's a machloket whether if you gather, let's say I say this pile of money is going to be my half shekel. What if I have more than a half a shekel value? Is that money sanctified or not? Right? So Beit Shammai says it's sanctified. Beit Hillel says it's not sanctified. And there's a distinction made, basically how I state what I'm doing. Am I collecting all of this is for my shekel, or from this is going to be my shekel? From here, there's a discussion about currency, and my friend Shuli Mishkin wrote a very nice piece on the Hadran website about currency in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Just an interesting idea, something that I learned from her this week. There were no coins in the time of the Bible, meaning in the time of the Tanakh, meaning all the way from the beginning of time to through the end of the Tanakh. There weren't any minted coins. They only show up later on in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And Shuli goes through the historical findings. But basically, anytime the Tanakh speaks about coins or money, it's in weight value, right? So that's why she says, right, it's called a shekel from the word mishkal, its weight, right? So when Abraham buys Maharat Machpelah, the cave of the patriarchs, for 400 silver shekel, it's actually I don't want to use the word pounds, but right, weight. It's 400 mishkal of silver, where they take out a scale and they actually weigh it. So that's just interesting to think about what that means. It a little bit messes up what we talked about a few minutes ago, that God showed Moshe a fiery half shekel coin. So that's just interesting. We have to think about what that means. But that's just some historical evidence. Okay, let's continue. Yes, that's true. We do deal with silver and gold by weight, but we're very used to currency nowadays. The Gemara talks about giving half of whatever currency we have. So it is interesting that we should recognize that there is currency and then there is weight. A very nice idea on Daf 6 talked about why we give machatzita shekel, why we give the half shekel. Maybe it's because Bnei Israel, the Jewish people, sinned at the half mark of the day. Therefore, right, that's Chet HaEgel, the golden calf. It was done at noon. Therefore, it's half. Therefore, we have to pay half a shekel. The other is that the Masechet Shekel is the value of 10 gerah, again another coin, and since they transgressed all 10 commandments, they have to pay this 10 gerah, which is half a shekel. The other is, interestingly, that the brothers sold Joseph for 20 silver and 20 selah, which is 5 dinarim. 5 dinarim is the amount that you have to give for pidyon haben, redeeming the firstborn. So we kind of have to compensate, or that is our way to make up for that. The other is that each sold, right, again, each of the 10 brothers sold his brother, right, Joseph, for 2 silver, and again, 2 silver is 2 dinarim, which is machatzit hashekel. So I just thought that was interesting to see the different reasons maybe for why we give the half shekel. Okay, again, as I mentioned, what do we do with the leftover money? Is it chulin, meaning it is not sanctified, or is it sanctified? The Gemara talks about when things are left over, and it goes through many different things on Daf Vav on 6, and it talks about what we do with things that are left over, right? If you set aside money or objects for a certain sanctified ritual, is what do we do with the leftovers? And the Gemara goes through, or the Mishnah goes through many different things. So the Gemara explains, and we did learn this already in Psachim, that when we have a leftover Korban Pesach, it becomes a shlamim. And the Gemara talks about why, which is interesting because in Psachim we had a completely different reason. So that was, I thought, just very interesting. And then there's a whole discussion about the intent that one has when sacrificing this sacrifice, and how it affects the korban, the sacrifice, or it doesn't. Daf number 7 talks about when things are left over. Again, as I mentioned before, what do we do with those leftovers? So you can see here, motar means leftover. So if you, let's say, and this I thought was just interesting in terms of what happens when someone collects money for a specific, let's say, charity or purpose, and let's say you don't need the money anymore. So if you, let's say, collect money to redeem someone who is kidnapped, and you didn't need all that money, one option, so again, if you did it for a general cause, or for a whole group of people, so then you can keep it and do it for somebody, use it for somebody else. If you collected it for a specific person, so then you give him the leftover money. The same thing for charity. If it's a general fund, you continue giving to general people. If it was for a specific poor person, you give it to that person, even if they don't, even if they don't need it to buy, those few meals or whatever it is. The same thing with a fund for burial. If it's general, you should give it, keep it for burial funds for other people. The Gemara then goes into a discussion about burial customs. And I think the idea here is really when one buries a loved one, and let's say wants to make a beautiful monument or headstone, is it seen as being for the person who passed away, or is it seen that it is for the descendants? So that was just an interesting discussion, and it says that a righteous person should have a very modest burial plot. So that was, I thought, just very interesting. And from here, we finished the second chapter. Third chapter at the bottom of Daf 7, we have, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the 3 times a year they took money from the temple, again from the lishka, the office where they had the collection boxes. I just feel bad because here they made it look like it's like in buckets of gold. That was not the case. As I mentioned before, they were in these containers that had a very narrow top and a wide bottom. They would separate it before, right, 2 weeks before each one of the holidays. And here there's like a difference of opinion exactly what date it was separated on. But the idea is the same, that it's in preparation for the holiday. The Gemara says that this was also the time when they did, again, as I mentioned before, Maaser Behema. Again, Maaser Behema was when, you see all these sheep at the bottom, they would put all the sheep in a corral and then let them out one at a time, and they would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. When they would get to number 10, they would mark that animal. That animal needed to be brought to Jerusalem and eaten there by the owner. Now, these animals needed to be put into the corral together with animals that were born on the same year. You were tithing only animals born at the same time, the same period. So the Gemara on Daf 8 discusses what is considered the beginning and the end of the year for these animals. And here again, there's a difference of opinion. Is it Elul? Is it Tishrei? But the difference is, can these animals be tithed together or not? The question is, again, so Daf 8 talks about do we follow the time when the animals are conceived or when the animals were born? And again, as I mentioned, there are differences of opinions. The next Mishnah on Daf 8 talks about those, as I mentioned, the kupot or shofarot. Again, I don't really love this picture because I don't think it was so beautiful and in view. But again, imagine these containers. The Mishnah says that each one held 3 se'ah of coins, and on each one had the letter either Aleph, Bet, Gimel, or Alpha, Beta, Gamma. And I think I read a very nice commentary that the question is, why would you even think to put Greek letters on something in the temple? And the Gemara, a commentary said, this is to fulfill the verse that was said in the time of Noach that says that, again, Noach had 3 sons, that Japhet, who is where I would say the ancestor of Greece, it says that Japhet will be beautiful, and Japhet will dwell in the tent of Shem. Now, we are descendants of Shem, and here is a beautiful way to see that the Greek letters are dwelling within the temple of the Jewish people of Shem. So that was just, I thought, very, very interesting. Okay, from here, the rest of Daf 8 talks about different quantities, the shiurim of different things throughout, actually from Masechet Shabbat, which we actually learned together, and says that we can learn the different volumes based on our Gemara. So we see this is called a kupa, and it has 3 se'ah. Therefore, in Masechet Shabbat, when it mentions a kupa, it must mean that it is 3 se'ah. And from here, we get into a discussion of what is the amount that you are liable for carrying on Shabbat of wine. And here we get into a discussion. Again, as I mentioned, I love when we mention things that are current or what we're doing right now. So we mentioned the arba kosot, the 4 cups of wine that we drink on Pesach. We use that as a way to figure out what is the volume of wine that you are obligated, or I would say is considered a transgression for carrying on Shabbat. And then we get into a whole discussion about the 4 cups of wine. And lastly, Daf 9, Tet, continues talking about different values, different shiurim. And then we have an interesting story about Rav Bibi, who wouldn't answer a question because he was preoccupied and troubled by his poverty. So I think just interesting to see how it is very important that someone is can be preoccupied by his poverty. Something I forgot to mention on Daf 8 was the Mishnah talked about the person who is going to take out the money is not allowed to wear shoes or sandals or have any hems in his clothing. And the Mishnah explains we want to make sure we don't think that that person is going to steal money, but we want to make sure that nobody thinks that he is going to steal money. And Daf 9 talks more about that, that we want to make sure that the person's not allowed to have long hair, lest you think that they're putting the coins in his hair. And you have to speak with him the whole time, lest you think that he's putting the coins in his mouth. Again, this seems very strange. And the Gemara says, no, we want to make sure that you you don't arouse any suspicions. And the Gemara mentions the verse, V'hayitem nikiim mehashem u'miyisrael. We need to make sure that we are pure to God, meaning God knows exactly what we're thinking and what we're doing, but also to our fellow man. We want to make sure we are not arousing any suspicions, and therefore we want to get rid of all suspicious activity. The last thing I want to mention is the fact that when they would take the money, they would cover up whatever was left over in the box. And the Mishnah mentions that on the 1st of Nisan, the first time they would take the truma, that would be for having the people in Israel in mind. The second time they would take it before Shavuot is when they were thinking about the surrounding cities. And the last time before Sukkot, they would do it for the people who were in Bavel or the people who were in the further outskirts, in the rest of the world. But the Gemara says, oh, no, really we want to include everybody each time that they would take the money. And therefore, it was less important to think about who it was for, because really it was about taking for everyone. And I just want to mention at the bottom of, or towards the end of Daf number 9, is a very interesting discussion about character development. And here the Gemara says that when you are very quick to do things, when you're zealous, that leads to cleanliness, right? Zrizut leads to nikiyut, I would say cleanliness or purity, right? And that cleanliness leads to purity, and that leads to holiness, and that leads to humility, and that leads to fear of God, and that leads to piety, to chassidut, that leads to prophecy, or getting closer to God, which leads to the resurrection of the dead, to Tchiyat HaMetim, which leads to Eliyahu, to Elijah, and this is the ultimate salvation. It's just interesting to understand that this Gemara is the source for a very famous book called Mesilat Yesharim, the Path of the Just, and that talks about, every chapter talks about how to acquire each one of these traits. And it says, right, Each one of these traits is very important. How does one go about acquiring each one of those traits? And the last thing in the chapter is the Gemara going through each one of the traits and finding a source for it in the Torah. And with that, we finish the third chapter of Masechet Shekalim, and I look forward to continuing our learning and wishing everybody a Chag Sameach, and see you next week. So thank you very much, everybody.